And just so you guys know, we will be recording this class. So if you are in this Zoom, just know that we will be recording as well. So to start off, like I said before, I think it's extremely important that one, we start off not only acknowledging the importance of Black history, but we also acknowledge the people who set the ground for not only just Black people to acknowledge their own histories, but just everyone to acknowledge their own histories within whether it be no matter what institution it may be. So I really wanted to talk about first, and I emailed you guys this, I believe, if you got the email, but I wanted to start off talking about Carter G. Woodson. Are you guys all right now? No, no, no. Oh, sorry. Me and my girlfriend. Oh, excuse me. Yeah, sorry about that. But I really wanted to talk about the importance of Carter G. Woodson, especially towards how I was framing this class. So Carter G. Woodson, as you may or may not be familiar with, he is known as the father of Black history. He is the first person of enslaved descent, of someone to be descending from an enslaved person, to earn his PhD from Harvard. And not only did he earn his PhD, but he earned his PhD in history, specifically establishing at Harvard, as well as I would say almost every single institution within the United States. He established the studying and recording of Black history from an academic level. Of course, there were other individuals who were, either through oral histories or through other means were recording our history, but Carter G. Woodson really brought it to an academic model. And I very much say he is one of the I would say premier people allowing me to do such a class from this, because this is also from an academic standpoint as well. So let's go on to our first slide here, and this is kind of going to be an exercise, and this goes on to what we were talking about previously about what's the purpose of this class. So it's Black history, in my opinion, especially the analysis of American Black history, and we'll talk about other Black diasporas as we go on. But Black history is an appropriate and needed reassessment into America's past and how we teach it, including not so distant past. So as you might have seen through my email as well, we will be touching history as recent as nearly 5 years ago as well, because that's extremely important as well, that we continue to recount our histories, whether they be recent or whether they be 200 years ago or 300 or 400 years ago in the past. So that's very important as well. So, and not just Redlands, but across the country, Black history is seen as an affront to a lot of people's interpretations of American history. I think a lot of us, especially, we all range in ages and we all range in terms of origins of where we come from within the United States or outside the United States. And I would definitely say that a lot of us have a different interpretation, or some of us don't even have an interpretation of what Black history is through the public schooling. Unfortunately, some of us may have not been either given that lesson, or some of us have been, taught a very skewed perspective of Black history. And I'll talk about that later, as you'll see the quote below. But the problem that we're seeing with Black history being taught, not only just years ago, but still currently, is that we're seeing it kind of be molded to be for other people's political gain or for other people's political narrative. So I wanted to talk about a problem that I was listening to this podcast, and it's two individuals who come from Mississippi, and they talk about things that go on within schooling in Mississippi and the landscape of education. And here's a quote from this podcast, and it's more of a quote from actually a Mississippi State studies textbook, actually, and this is taught from K through 12. So it says, and I quote, in 1955, J.P. Coleman, the Attorney General from Choctaw County, was elected governor in Mississippi's first general election after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Coleman promised to keep the school segregated. He proved to be a moderating force during a very difficult time. Just after the election, Emmett Till, a young Black man from Chicago, allegedly made a pass at a white woman at a rural store. Two men kidnapped him, beat him, killed him, and threw his body in the Tallahatchie River. The coverage of the trial and the murderers, who later admitted their guilt, painted a poor picture of Mississippi and its white citizens. So before we move on to the next slide, whether you do it through chat or whether you do it vocally through the Zoom here, I want you guys to kind of identify some things that you see in this excerpt from this state studies textbook. And I want you guys to kind of highlight some words or really put in the chat some words that you really notice that kind of either kind of put something in your brain or say, oh, this is not really right, or maybe this is something that really stood out to me, because we'll really be talking about this as a foundation of the class in terms of the way that Black history has been taught and portrayed. So if you can, I'll give you about 2 minutes to do that, but really just look at very specific word choices, look at the way that some people are portrayed in this, in that excerpts, and look at the specific words that are attached to specific people within that excerpt. And I would say let's give it until about 4:10, so about 2 minutes.
Hey, Byron, can you move the slide
Yes,
over a
gotcha.
little bit? Thank you.
All right, since we're coming around to that 2 minute mark, does anyone have anything that they notice about the excerpt or anything that they want to bring attention to within the specific excerpt that you really, that's kind of standing out to you here? You could either put in the chat or you could either just speak up through the Zoom here. All right, so what here's what I noticed about the excerpt, and we can kind of talk about this further. But I kind of highlighted slash emboldened some words from the excerpt that I really kind of took notice of. So to kind of read it again, in 1955, J.P. Coleman, the Attorney General from Choctaw County, was elected governor in Mississippi's first general election after the Brown v. Board of Education decision. Coleman promised to keep the schools segregated. He proved to be a moderating force during a very difficult time. Now, obviously, the reason why I highlighted moderating was obviously the morals of the South, and I'll kind of we'll definitely talk about this today, but the morals of the South and the North are not exactly polar opposites, but the moral of the South tends to be more conservative, especially when we hit especially after the Emancipation Proclamation. And I'll kind of talk about it a little later, but I would actually say when it comes to Black history, the most violent time in Black history in America actually tends to be after slavery. And we'll talk about that a bit later. But the reason why I highlight moderating is that it's almost insane to say that the person, and we are looking at this from a modern context, but even in 1955, to say that a person who still wanted to keep, who wanted to keep school segregation as a policy enforced by the state of Mississippi as a moderating force. This is not in any way, even by the standards of 1955, this is not someone who would be considered a moderate, or this is not someone who would be considered a moderating force. So that's something I looked at. Um, and then, quote, just after the election, Emmett Till, a young Black man from Chicago, allegedly made a pass at a white woman from a rural store. Now, this sentence is extremely encapsulating a lot of how, especially we see a lot of school districts in the South, and this is not to rag on the South, but I really think there is kind of a different telling of Black history in a lot of different school districts, even outside of the South. One, when it comes to portraying Emmett Till as a young Black man, I think, and this is something that we'll talk about as well, we have to be very, very selective about the way that we portray, especially Black children, because unfortunately a lot of Black children are adultified in history, and Emmett Till happens to be one of those cases. If you don't know the story of Emmett Till, we will talk about that next week. However, to kind of provide a short explanation, Emmett Till is not a man. Emmett Till was 14 years old when he was slain and when this incident had happened. So in a history book, to describe him as a young Black man, one, assumes or portrays him as an adult when he was not. And then two, it also tells the story in a different way. It makes him seem as if he was responsible for his own slaying, which we'll talk about, in which he was not. And then we'll further talk about, and another thing that I've highlighted here, even though it was not a lot more than two. So the way that the story is portrayed, it's portrayed as, oh, it was just two lone actors who just were just rebels of the community who really weren't a representation of that community there. However, if you also know the story of Emmett Till and also the story of a lot of Black people who are unfortunate victims of lynch mobs, Emmett Till was the victim of a lynch mob, which we would see entire communities come out, unfortunately, and hunt, whether they be children, young men, young adults, young women. And it wasn't just two people. So that's something that we also have to be very careful of when it comes to the accuracy of portraying Black history. And then the coverage of the trial and acquittal of his accused murderers, who later admitted their guilt in an article in a national magazine, painted a poor picture of Missouri, I'm sorry, not Missouri, Mississippi and its white citizens. So the thing is, and I think this is a fear a lot of people, you might see with a lot of people, whether it be, honest or dishonest, is there is this fear that has been put out that the accurate portrayal of Black history is, one, inherently political, and two, that it's inherently dangerous to other people within society, which the point of this course is very much to say, is to have an open conversation and say, it should not be inherently dangerous to acknowledge this history's actual to acknowledge this country's actual history. It should never be. And yes, that is a reckoning that we will have to take emotionally. However, it should never be a threat to anyone to actually acknowledge this country's actual history. So that's something that I really take notice of there. But let's go on to our next slide here. And as you might have heard or seen within my email or just seen within announcements as well, I really wanted to talk about, before we even go on to the general history of the transatlantic slave trade, I also wanted to make sure that we're talking about the people who were here on this land before us. And I won't specifically go into so much detail in which I'm talking about every single group, but I wanted to talk about how those peoples came here before us and how exactly and we'll go a bit into Christopher Columbus as well, because it's necessary to talk about the beginning of slavery and the beginning of the slave trade. But when we talk about the origins of our Native Americans or our first peoples, the population of the lands covering northern and the northern and southern American continents. So this is all the way from Alaska and Canada all the way down to the southernmost tip of Southern America, are people who originally had inhabited lands between Siberia and Alaska, so really eastern Russia, eastern Eurasia, and Eastern Asia, Northeastern Asia. And it is believed, this is, and a lot of this data and a lot of this information actually comes from genetic data as well. So a lot of it is obviously, because this is so back in the past, there's not really much historical record. However, a lot of scientists actually have tested the genetic similarities between descendants of these native peoples and people originating who are still living in Eastern Asia. And there is a genetic similarity between those people, so much to the point that it is reasonable to generally theorize that the original native peoples who got here originally had migrated from Eastern Asia, Alaska, Siberia, etc. So basically, they had essentially migrated over a land bridge between Siberia and Alaska. So we'll kind of talk about exactly how they came down, but it's essentially believed that that groups that are indigenous to the Americas descend from Siberian East Asia, uh, Siberian East Asians, and Pacific Islander Melanesians. So to kind of explain what Melanesians are, Islander Melanesians, in a scientific term, usually refer to those who are what we would see now as, say, Fijian, Samoan, and other Pacific Islander descents as well. Said groups primarily settled in upper North America, and as they continued to migrate to North America through the Bering Strait land bridge, which is a land bridge that was frozen between Alaska and Russia, they would eventually come down and migrate all the way down to the southernmost tip of South America, including areas within the United States, Latin America, and South America. What's going on here? Okay. All right. Does everyone, are we all good? Anything that needs to be clarified at the current moment? Okay, there we go. So when going back to the Bering Land Bridge, as you could see, the two arrows, that area, and this area is mainly between Alaska, and this is around, as you could see, about 1,200 to 1,400 years ago. But between the Bering Land Bridge, Alaska, and I would say Alaska, so kind of in the area between Alaska, Canada, and the United States. This used to be kind of a more frozen area. Now it's more, because of just general climate change and just general geographical and topological changes. There really has been a change to this area, and it's not as crossable as it used to be. But when the Earth was generally colder, this was a general land bridge, and it's theorized that what we now know as Native Americans used this land bridge to migrate over to North America and South America. And eventually, later on, as they moved into, as we were saying before, what is now known as modern day Canada, Alaska, upper North America, they then eventually started to migrate down further south into, now what we know as Mexico, Latin America, South America, etc. So the thing that we also have to reckon with, and the thing that we also have to talk about, is when we talk about Native peoples, and when we talk about the founding or discovering or the exploration of America, or the inception of the exploration of America, we really also have to talk about Columbus and the slave trade. And the reason why I really started this Zoom meeting saying that we all have had different interpretations of not only Black history but American history is because as scholars and historians discover different things throughout history, or as they rectify things that have been common held misconceptions, sometimes we get that in our curriculum and sometimes we don't get that in that curriculum. And I think I would say the longest held misconception when it comes to American history, in my opinion, I think that's starting to become rectified. But I think the longest held misconception when it comes to American history tends to be Columbus and his journeys within the Americas. So to kind of start out, most of, if not all of Columbus's encounters in America is kind of a misnomer within itself, because most of his journeys, or most of his entire expedition, was not in the contiguous United States. It was not within the 50 states. It was within the Caribbean. So he was more in the areas of what we know as modern day Haiti and Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. That is exactly where Columbus had eventually had done his exploration and done essentially a lot of his journeys and a lot of his work. And so Columbus's journeys were not the foundation of the 50 states nor English colonization. To really kind of describe it, the colonization of the Americas, or what we now know of the Americas, was really started by the Portuguese and the want to essentially create an economic powerhouse. There is a component of some individuals who came to the United States around the 15 to 1600s who were looking for religious freedom, but for the most part, the purpose of colonizing North and South America was to make money. It was a business, essentially. So, essentially, when we teach Black history, or even any other genre of American history, or just American history as a whole, it's important that we address these misconceptions first before we get into these details, because unfortunately, if we come in with misconceptions about Columbus, or we come in with misconceptions about other parts of history, then we really don't have a good foundation of going into history in the first place. So one of the misconceptions that I think all of us have really had in our brain for some time, and of course I think we've really changed the terminology over the last 10 to 20 years, was the things or the exact names that we bestow upon the first peoples or Native Americans, or as older people or just people who are more used to the terminology we would call Indians. So the tale is told that the reason that we call Native American peoples or first peoples Indians was because it is believed that Columbus accidentally discovered America and in journey, or he was looking for India, but he accidentally discovered America, and therefore that's exactly why we call Native American people or people who are on who were here on this land first Indians. That's not exactly the case, and the reason why I mentioned the where exactly Columbus was first was, one, it wouldn't make sense that we would call Native American peoples of the United States Indians, considering Columbus never stepped foot in the contiguous United States. He never stepped foot in the 50 states, and he really was only in the areas, the only native or indigenous people he really interacted with were the Taino people in Puerto Rico. So it wouldn't really make sense historically for us to call the people of originally, or the first peoples of this land, Indians, considering Columbus really didn't have any specific encounters with native peoples of the 50 states. Um, so, and also the issue with saying that was when Columbus, in 1492, as we're told, around the time of 1492, India was not a unified nation and was not called India during that time. India as a unified nation really did not exist, or to be quite honest, India as a unified nation being called India did not exist until British colonialization. And we'll kind of talk about this more, but the concept of a nation itself is a relatively new concept. It really does not, especially for Asian and for the Asian and African continents, the nation really does not exist. Um, it doesn't really exist um, quite soon. But India instead, in other historic contexts, also could be referred to as a landmass, including current-day India, which also is known as the Indian subcontinent. Sorry about that. So this also, India was referred to as land that includes current-day Pakistan, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, Bhutan, Nepal, and the Maldives. So this is all Southeast Asia, essentially. Um, so to be quite honest, when we talk about the most popular myth of Indians and Christopher Columbus came to the United States, but we thought it was, we thought he was in India, so that's why he called people Indians, is not really a proper conception of what actually happened. And it goes to further show us that a lot of history that we were taught, or a lot of historical misconceptions that we have, we need to continue to reanalyze, because unfortunately a lot of it was inaccurate. And I think it does not tell the full story of not only those who were there and those of what actually happened, but it really does not give us a full picture of what happens later on in history. And we'll kind of talk about that more as we go on further to the slave trade. But this is actually a map, and I was talking about how India was not a full nation when when Columbus made his journey, so it wouldn't make sense for him to call it India in the first place. So this was in 1764. In 1492, India was much more broken up and much more separated. So if you look at this, there are multiple different states, there are multiple different regions, and as you could tell, besides in the corner, but we're only labeling it as India, so you know the familiarity. But as you could tell, none of these lands are called India. So it wouldn't really make historical sense for Columbus, or that whole myth of we call people Indians because he thought he was India. That historically, it just does not add up. And there's not actually much scholarship in support of that theory in the first place either. And going back to the lands in which we were talking about, I wanted to talk about further of where Christopher Columbus actually was. So this is the Antilles area, or the kind of what we would call the Western Caribbean area in which Columbus actually was. And as you could see, Columbus really did not have much presence in like I said, the 50 states, or what we now know as the 50 states. It was mainly the Caribbean, specifically, like I said, Cuba, Puerto Rico, Dominican Republic, and Haiti. That was those were really the main areas that he had inhabited or was more, had more involvement in. So when it comes to Columbus and the founding of what we now know as the 50 states, he really did not have much involvement. I would say Columbus was more involved in the colonization of the entirety of the Western Hemisphere. So I think that's where we need to really put our mindset at when we think of Columbus, or if we're thinking of Columbus. But we won't really talk about him much more in this course. To be quite honest, this is the last little excerpt about that. But I just wanted to lay a proper foundation when it comes to how we discuss historical misconceptions or anything like that. But before we kind of go on to the more of the meat of the theme of this week, does anyone have any questions, comments, concerns about what I just talked about, or does anyone have any other queries that they might want to go over? All right, so I'm going to move on towards some terminology that we'll be using. So in general, when it comes to slavery and how we describe slavery, there are going to be some terms, if you've ever, have looked at how slavery has been described in a history book, you've probably heard three main terms when it comes to slavery or how slavery has been described specifically in America. But yes, I will. So basically, when it comes to Native Americans not being Indians, India back in 1492, when Columbus sailed the ocean blue, as they say, India as a nation did not exist. So there was no moniker of calling Indians or people who lived in modern day India Indians in the first place. That term did not exist. If you want to know what others or people outside of India described India as it is now, it was called Hindustan at that point. Hindustan basically means the land of Hindus, because at that time and still today, India is a majority Hindu country. But when it comes, like I said, the reason why we shouldn't call Native peoples, Indians or in the first place, it just historically doesn't make sense. India as a full-on combined country did not exist. The term India rarely was used, and Columbus himself did not touch the areas that we call people Indians for. Like if we call native peoples of America or the United States Indians when Columbus did not even go to that land, it just does not make any sense. Um, but back to more terminology. I know we're kind of starting off like I just very much want to clarify and clear the deck about the terminology that I'm using, and I want to be provide as many definitions as possible so I can just use this terminology interchangeably, and so we don't have to go over the definition every single time. So when it comes to the terminology around slavery and what differentiates American chattel slavery from historical instances of slavery, we really have to realize that when it comes to American chattel slavery, or what is defined as, and we'll define American chattel slavery on the next slide, but the difference between slavery, when you see, like, for example, in the movies, when you see movies about Rome, you'll see, people who were enslaved or things like that. American chattel slavery is unique because, one, it was the first time, it was one of the very few and rare times in history, I think almost the first time in history, in which people were owned for life. Two, human beings were considered property. The only other times in history in which people were enslaved, for example, in Europe, even in the Arab world, was when people were either prisoners of war, or they were indebted to other people, or they were criminals in some fashion. This was the first time really in modern history that we had, one, people enslaved for life, two, human beings being fully owned as if they were property or animals, and three, it was a situation in which there was no way, like, if you were previously enslaved before American chattel slavery, you were working off a debt and you would eventually be freed. Or sometimes and we'll talk about indentured servitude, because indentured servitude did exist in the United States, especially with not just African American people, but also with other populations that were considered marginalized at the time, specifically Scottish and Irish Americans at the time. But it was really the first time in which you saw that you either were going to get out of slavery either through death, or if you escaped. And that was the first time. It's so unique to the point in which you there was nothing seen like that in history. And that's the true brutality of American chattel slavery, is that there was no real there was nothing like it seen before. So when we come to American chattel slavery, and this is why I have this specific definition, and I'll talk about the etymological reasons for it and the meaning of it. Now, tell me if I'm too verbose. I am very much still indoctrinated into my formal education as an English major, so I will talk about etymological meanings until I can exhaust myself. But to talk about what an etymology is, it's basically the origin of the word. English descends from two different language families. It descends from a Germanic language, mainly German, and two Romantic Old English languages. So basically Latin/English languages. But here's what the etymological origin of chattel is, which is the part of chattel slavery that I was talking about. Chattel essentially means to own something. It's about 13th century French land culture. It means to own something, usually land, sometimes farm animals. And chattel in today's context mainly means real estate property, aside from land. So it might be, something else that you might own on the land, like an animal in some cases. Um, but chattel's context and the context of American slavery is more of a this is the first time that people are being owned, and people not just, and we'll talk about it later, but the products of people, whether it be their labor or even children, are therefore owned by the person who owns that person. So, to give you a working definition of chattel slavery, basically it's a legal system enslaving and enabling the ownership of people, primarily African peoples and descendants of African peoples. American chattel slavery was also supported and justified through a rigid set of social norms, racist pseudoscience, and the creation of a racial and ethnic hierarchy. And we'll talk about that in a couple of different slides. But the reason why I also say that it's really set up by a racial hierarchy is if you are a nation that supports liberty and justice for all, and that said nation not only legalizes but encourages the owning of other people, how do you justify that? And you justify that by saying if you look a certain way or you appear a certain way or based on your birth, you are not a person under our laws. That is exactly as to why it's justified through a rigid set of social norms, racial pseudoscience, and the creation of a racial and ethnic hierarchy. Um, I'm just going to take a quick moment to look at our chat. Yes, I will try to simplify as much as possible. So the differences between, I want to talk about the differences between American chattel slavery, servitude, and indentured servitude. Some of you may be familiar with indentured servitude or indentured slavery. It's basically when someone, for example, usually this happened in the American context when it came to Scottish and Irish people, where, for example, someone committed a crime back in the United Kingdom, or someone is indebted to someone back in the United Kingdom, and they would come to the United States to work off their debt or to work off the crime. That's what indentured servitude essentially is. Um, so we already went over the definition of chattel slavery, but servitude is a general umbrella term that also includes servitude, that also includes slavery. So basically, it's anything from slavery, whether it be agricultural work or farm work or domestic work. And we'll talk about how slavery is not exclusive to the South, and it's not exclusive to working in the fields either. It is slavery in the United States went all when in my well not just my opinion in history's opinion, whether it be legal or illegal, it went from coast to coast, and it went from north to south, and it went from domestic to agricultural. There is no real there was yes there were states that were considered free states, and we'll talk about that when we get to the Civil War module, which will be next week. But there were certainly areas in which slavery had was obviously legalized, but there were also areas in which slavery was technically illegal. However, people were turning a blind eye when people were being owned. And then indentured servitude, like I said, is a temporary servitude, usually to pay off a debt or usually to, as restitution for a crime. And we would usually see that with Scottish and Irish Americans. Um, Scottish and Irish Americans, in the context of American history, play a very interesting role. They tend to, they were, I would say, especially within the first 100 years of the country, they were heavily persecuted mainly because they were Catholic, and there was still a large conflict over Protestant and Catholic religions at the time. And then also because um, the definition of white in America changes over time, as we'll talk about. So, for a while, being white in America was being a Protestant directly from the United Kingdom, and that was everyone else. So, besides that, if you were Spanish and you were Catholic and you were from Spain, you were not considered white. However, 60 years later, you may be considered white. So, that is an evolving definition within itself. But these are the definitions that we really have. But for the most part, especially for this week's class, we'll really be talking a lot more about American chattel slavery. If anything, we'll be talking only about American chattel slavery. Um, but we want to talk about how slavery as an institution and how the transportation, or what we call the Middle Passage, of nearly 12.5 million African people starts. So the reason as to why the transatlantic slave trade happens is, as I said before, European presence in the New World, or the Western Hemisphere, is to mainly set up a business. Like I said before, there are people who came here for religious freedom, but for the most part, European presence, specifically Portuguese presence, and the Americas, and Spanish presence, and later on, eventually the United Kingdom and other societies, they were really coming to the United States to set it up as an economy or as a business. They were using the land because it was much more fertile land in terms of crops. Because if you, whether you have or been to the United Kingdom or even just Western Europe in general, for the most part, it's very cold and it's very rainy, and it's not really the best place to grow crops, or it's not really the best place for agriculture. And it's very small. If you've ever been to the United Kingdom, especially the current United Kingdom, it's very packed and tight. There's not much, you know, there are, of course, a lot of green spaces, but at the same time, it's not that there's not so much expansive lands to the point in which you can magically expand everywhere. So, really, the developing of what we now know as Northern America and Southern America as colonies was for the purpose of business. It was the purpose of growing crops, and it was the purpose of really making money in the New World. So, as European powers began to colonize the Americas, the need for labor grew. A couple of things, and going back to the first, or indigenous peoples of this land, a couple of things happened as to where, obviously, one, a lot of the people who were coming over to the Americas were businessmen. So obviously, they didn't want to do the work for themselves. And two, I would also say the indigenous people of the area were not wanting to do the work because, one, obviously there was already an adversarial relationship between European peoples and indigenous peoples. Two, European peoples, even though they were already immune to smallpox, ravaged the pop essentially ravaged indigenous peoples, specifically in Southern America, with smallpox. So there's actually a statistic in which, because of smallpox and also because of other forms of violence, 90% of the indigenous population in Mexico was wiped out within only a couple of years of European expedition into Northern and Southern America. So that's also a reason as to why the need for laborers essentially needed to happen, is because, one, the indigenous population didn't want to do the work because, obviously, you're having people invade your land and telling you that you have to work essentially for free, and no one would want to do that. And then two, you also had a situation in which, even if they were forced to work, they couldn't work because they were being ravaged by smallpox. And then three, as well, it was a situation of, there was such an adversarial relationship for obvious reasons. So even if they didn't die from smallpox, there were multiple conflicts and multiple wars happening during this time. So there was no real reliable source of labor because there were not enough indentured servants from either Ireland or Scotland to do that work. And also, too, because they were Irish and Scottish, they had more rights than, say, an indigenous person or an African person at the time would have. And it was a situation in which really there was nowhere else to turn for labor. So there was before this, before really the 1400s, before Columbus, there was no real relationship between, especially, northwestern Europe. There was no real relationship between Western Europe and sub-Saharan Africa. There was a bit of a relationship for the Maghreb, which is northern Africa, Egypt, Morocco, those countries, Arab countries mainly, but there was not much of a relationship of African countries and European countries. There was a bit of trade, not directly, but there was some trade as either African countries would serve as a middleman. Of course, there were very successful societies within West Africa, specifically the Mali Empire, led by Mansa Musa. But there really wasn't contact between Western European societies and Sub-Saharan African societies, and there really wasn't any other sort of relationship between those two societies, really until the Portuguese start to make their way into North Africa. Um, Previously, with the Spanish Inquisition and other efforts, and also other invasion efforts, there was some warring tensions between Muslim societies and the Arab states, and also Catholic societies within Portugal and Spain. But it really wasn't until Portugal went down to what is now known as Ghana, or known as the Gold Coast, and established what is called Elmina. And unfortunately, Elmina was then used in the 1400s as a place to store kidnapped Africans before they were transported across the Atlantic Ocean and sold into slavery. And we'll talk about this in the next slide. But not every single person from Western Africa, if this is known or not amongst you, was sold into slavery into the United States. To define another term, there's a term called diaspora, and that means a group of people, say they are originate in Africa, and the diaspora is that group of people who finds themselves in other nations or other parts of the world, but they're still culturally connected by one common origin or one common birthing point, or one common area in which their ancestors came from. So when we talk about the African diaspora, we're talking about current day Black Americans. We're talking about Africans who are still living in Africa. We're talking about Africans who found themselves in the Caribbean, like Jamaicans and Puerto Ricans. And we're also talking about African peoples or people of African descent who have found themselves in other places of the world as well. So when we talk about the slave trade as an institution, we also do have to realize that it wasn't just the United States in which people were being transported. And also, and I talked about this a bit earlier, but it just wasn't the South either when it comes to slavery. It was the North. It was all the way from Maine, and it was all the way down to Florida. It was also in Jamaica. It was in Brazil. It was in almost every single country within Northern and Southern America. And also the Caribbean as well. I believe I have a map. Yes, I do have a map of exactly where we saw a lot of different kidnapped African peoples go. And it wasn't just the North and South America. As you could see on the map here, there are also some people who are transported from more Central West Africa to Morocco, to Tunisia, to Libya, to Egypt, and even the Gulf Coast, or the Arabian Peninsula, specifically near more Yemen and Saudi Arabia. And also, there are people from Madagascar and I would say, southeastern Africa being transported into parts of South Asia, specifically India as well. And what we also see is, like I said before, we also see people go to the Caribbean. Sugar plantations were very popular in Jamaica, Cuba, the Dominican Republic, Jamaica, Brazil. So when it comes to what I call the Black diaspora, the United States actually has the the second most amount of people of African descent outside of Africa. The number one country outside of Africa that has the most people of African descent is actually Brazil. So even though we won't really cover most of all those histories because that would be I would have to cover so many countries, just know that there's a large black diaspora every nearly everywhere, especially in northern South America, even in Mexico. It's being labeled as Veracruz here, but in Mexico, if you didn't know, the first president of Mexico was actually a black man. He was a person of African descent. His name was Vicente Guerrero, and he was actually not only the first black president of North America and of Mexico, and the first president in general, but he was also instrumental in ending slavery in Mexico as well. We'll talk about that during the Civil War and how exactly Mexico ending slavery would essentially almost lead to the would actually lead to Texas and California and a lot of those areas joining the union. But we'll talk about that later. But as I said before, there is a lot of there are a lot of different nations. There are a lot of destinations for the near 15, near millions of African people who were taken via the transatlantic slave trade. Does anyone have any questions on that? Any questions about the destinations of some Black people, or does anyone have any questions just in general so far before we move on?
Yeah, I have a quick question, Byron. Will you, if I miss it, let me know, but will you have like links of articles that we can reference and like read up on in between
Yeah.
classes and okay.
I will be sending them through emails, and also at the end, I'll probably send an email to everyone here. But there's a book, and we'll talk about this later, that I think is really instructive for this class after as well. If you'd like to go into that, so I'll also be supplying some reading, content. Of course, all optional, of course.
Okay, thank you.
So next, I wanted to talk more about the people of the slave trade. You might have heard me use very specific wording when it comes to people of the slave trade. I might have said, and this is out of habit, I might have said slaves, but the terminology that I like to use to give people more humanity is, and this is something that really has really arisen in academia for, I would say, within the last 5 to 10 years, is when we describe people who were slaves or people who were enslaved, we usually say enslaved people. And the reason why we say that is because we don't want to define someone's humanity, whether they be living or dead, by their status of being enslaved. So typically people who were enslaved, we call enslaved people, and then, et cetera, et cetera. But like I said before, there was nearly 12.5 million Africans, mainly from the West Coast. There were some from, the Southwest and Southeast coast, like I described before, but mainly the origin, sorry about this, mainly the origin of a lot of these peoples who were transported via the transatlantic slave trade come from countries mainly on the west coast of Africa, kind of like the central to northwest coast of Africa, mainly from Ghana, Nigeria, Senegal, some from the Ivory Coast, and some of what's now called modern day Liberia, which a bit on Liberia. Liberia is the first nation to be established in Africa, but it's also a nation to be established for formerly enslaved people from the United States to come back to Africa. And we'll kind of talk about that more when we get on to more recent movements, especially when we come to the Pan African Garvey movement. But there's really a kind of most of the people that we're seeing are descendants of West African people, like I said, from Ghana, Nigeria, the Ivory Coast, Senegal, Liberia, etc. But the reason why we want to make sure that we talk about and humanize people within the slave trade is that it's really important to teach this accurately, and it's really important to humanize the people who were unfortunately kidnapped and enslaved, because like I said, and like we discussed previously, a lot of people have continued to and will continue to manipulate Black history for their own political purposes. And there are really I would say, two political narratives that we usually see, or two misconceptions or purposeful misconceptions that we see when it comes to the teaching of American slavery. One being that Africans traded each other, and that's the reason for the Atlantic slave trade. And we'll talk about how that actually happened. And then two, the second was that the first state recognized slave owner in the United States was a black man, and therefore it disproves that American slavery was not a racially based institution. But we'll talk about those claims in the next slide here. So let's talk about the first claim, and you might have heard it, whether it be on a political podcast or whether it be on a debate, of this claim that Africans sold other Africans, and therefore, because Africans sold other Africans, European people or other people who were involved in slave trade, and European people were not the only powers involved in the slave trade. There was also a significant Arab presence in the slave trade as well. But because, and I will say this flat out, just because, and I will say this as well, there was definitely a presence of other African tribes selling or transporting other African peoples to European businesses or European colonists as a way of making money. But that does not, in any way, in my opinion, and just in general, denote anything of the wrongs of slavery from any party's perspective. So the nation, and this is why I spoke about nations being rare, like very new concepts, is because the nation, especially outside of Europe, is a relatively new concept. Most African nations that we know now were established mainly 60 to 70 years ago. The nation that we know as Liberia was established in the 50s. The Democratic Republic of the Congo was established in the 60s. Nigeria was established in the 60s. And it's not to say that there weren't thriving societies in these areas. There were incredibly thriving societies in these areas already. However, the nation system of this is the country of Germany, or this is the country of England, or this is the country of Spain, or this is the country of Portugal, was really a European concept. So what we saw in Africa was more societies besides, like, for example, the Mali Empire was a country within itself. So yes, you could say Mali already was more of an established organization. But besides that, what we saw in Africa was more areas, not specifically drawn borders, but more multiple different tribes defined by their own ethnic differences as well as linguistic differences, and also other cultural differences. So what we now know as Africa was really a result of the Berlin Conference of 1884 to 1885, which really, if you're not familiar, it basically drew all the borders in Africa. So the reason that we have Nigeria, and the reason why Nigeria has as much land as it does, sorry, Deborah, is because of the Berlin Conference. The reason why we have the Democratic Republic of the Congo has the land that it does now, and the reason why it has the borders that it does now is because of the Berlin Conference. And the Berlin Conference was when European powers knew that Africa was rich in resources because they had already been using their resources, whether it be human resources or whether it be other resources, more hard resources, and they knew that it was rich in resources. So European powers came back together and then said that it was then necessary to carve up that land from themselves, so they were not actively fighting over African countries or African land. So the next misconception that we're going to go over is that the first state recognized American enslaver, the first recognized American slaveholder, was a black man. So this is a claim that you might have heard that's usually used to say that slavery in America is not a racial institution, but it's rather just an institution of power and government, which is an institution of power and government, but there is a racial component to it. This claim usually refers to a man named Anthony Johnson. This title was not bestowed upon Johnson because of actual history, but rather years of disinformation. So this is what I'm talking about when it comes to Black history and disinformation. This whole thing that has gone into a lot of people's minds of, oh, the first slave owner in America was a Black man, was because of 10 years of misinformation and a very politically motivated historian who was basically very bent on saying that slavery was not a racial institution. So he essentially tried to point evidence in a way saying that the first American slaver was a black man, that was not the case. Sorry about that. So the person that we're actually referring to, this Anthony Johnson individual, was an actual person. He was actually an African person named who was given the name Antonio, and he arrived in America in 1621. And we'll talk about the first date, but usually the date that's been given and the research I did, it's quite accurate. The first arrival of African peoples in the United States to fulfill labor needs or enslaved African peoples was in 1609 in Virginia. So that kind of 1619 that you've been hearing, whether 1619 prior or just in general because of other political issues that are going on, that 1619 is quite accurate in terms of at least the records that historians have access to. But this individual named Antonio, he arrived in America in 1621, and he was an indentured servant. And going back to that definition of indentured servant, he actually eventually was freed because he was only involved in indentured servitude. So sorry about that. For some reason, I timed out. Let's get back to that here. All right. Sorry about that. But back to what I was saying on the issue. Um, so he would eventually be, like I said, he would eventually be freed. Um, Sorry, I'm trying to get back to where we were. Yes. He would eventually be freed. Let me make sure that I am all okay. I'm all good. Um, but he would eventually be freed, and eventually he would go on to own land. However, the actual first instance of someone who was a perpetual enslaved person or someone who was under perpetual slavery was a man by the name of John Punch, who came into the country around maybe about 20 years later. Now, this was the first recorded instance. There were already enslaved people in the United States by 1619, but this was the first recorded instance via state record. Um, and this individual, this was also an African person who was given the name John Punch, and he was enslaved by a man by the name of Hugh Gwynn. And this was the actual first state recognized enslaver and the first actual state recognized enslaved person to exist within the United States. With that, let's get on to our next slide. So you might have been thinking, or just what you have heard about slavery. I think, and I think this is a question a lot of us ask about ourselves. How does a system essentially enslaving people not only, saying that I own you as another person or another person is being owned for their entire life, how is that justified? How is that justified in a country that once again says liberty and justice for all, that everyone has the right to self-determination and everyone has the right to self-ownership and everyone has the right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness? How does a country that holds up all of those ideals essentially justify and have the institution of slavery for over 200 years? Well, the reason for that is because there are about, this is how I've conceptualized it, there are about four methods of dehumanization that that really happen to justify slavery. And we'll go over the first four, which are chattelization, animalization, brutalization, and theatric commodification. Now, those are a lot of Asian words, and those are a lot of words going on there. So let me explain that further. So chattelization, or to chattelize someone, and you heard this word when it comes to American chattel slavery, is basically to make them a commodity that can be bought and sold. So to justify slavery, you have to dehumanize someone. And to dehumanize someone, if you can just buy someone off of the street, like for example, going to if you go to the Dollar Tree and you buy a pencil, you're not going to conceive that as a person. That's the exact same method of dehumanization that was used to basically justify slavery. If a person who is buying another person does not see that person as a human being, then slavery is completely justified. The second is animalization. It's basically making someone seem as if they are a livestock animal, like a cow. And we'll talk about slave auctions in general and how a lot of the work slave auctions did that work. But animalization very much makes a person feel as if they had they well not makes a person, but basically makes enslaved people into animals. It's like a lot of slave auctions were very similar to livestock auctions. It was very much checking the physical features of an individual. It was very much checking how much they could work or how much they could work for a person. And then the third is brutalization. If you essentially commit such violence against someone or you disfigure someone, you can't see them as human. They are therefore dehumanized. And the fourth is theatric commodification. And that is my fancy word for minstrel entertainment, essentially. So minstrel entertainment, we'll talk about that on the last slide of this lesson here. But it's really about dehumanizing or downplaying someone's plight or downplaying or saying slavery wasn't so bad by making someone entertainment. So a lot of minstrel entertainment, for example, is blackface, or you may be familiar. We'll talk about this, but it's also the Aunt Jemima situation, and we'll talk about how that was a controversy as well. Um, but when it comes to chattelization, like I said, it's very much making someone a function of commerce. It's making someone who can be bought and sold, and that's how you dehumanize someone. So, like I said, I asked the question before: if you would you humanize, the plastic bags that you get at a convenience store? Would you humanize the pencils that you get at the Dollar Tree? Would you humanize the napkins that you buy at Vons? By basically making someone a function of commerce, or by making someone a function of the economy that can be easily bought and sold, they are dehumanized. They are not seen as human, and therefore slavery is seen as acceptable. This is, and I would really say a lot of this work was done through slave auctions as well. And a slave auction, essentially, for those who are not knowing, is when recently kidnapped or even people who recently had fallen out of slavery, whether it be because their owner had died or there was no direct successor, they were sold sold in an auction, like a car, like a valuable item, to the highest bidder. And it basically their value was determined on their physical attributes, things like that. So I wanted to read a poem from actually a freed woman, but a lot of the people she knew had gone through slavery because she lived in Maryland. But we'll talk about weeks down the line when we talk about literature and slave narrative literature. But a lot of slave narratives um, were censored because slavery, to be quite honest, as some of us may or may not know, was incredibly brutal. It was a system of domination, it was a system of violence. And a lot of American readers, even though a lot of Americans were coming around to seeing slavery as what it was, a lot of American readers just did not have the stomach for it. So a lot of people who were enslaved were not published because it was a hard thing for Americans to stomach. So a lot of freed Black Americans would then write about their experiences because it was hard, it was easier for some people to kind of stomach. So here's a poem from Frances Ellen Watkins Harper, and I'll read it here. And it's titled "The Slave Auction," and it starts with saying the sale began. Young girls were there, defenseless in their wretchedness, whose stiff sobs of deep despair revealed their anguish and distress. And mothers stood with streaming eyes and saw their dearest children sold. Unheeded rose their bitter cries, while tyrants battered them for gold. And woman, with her love and truth, for those in stable forms may dwell, gazed on the husband of her youth with anguish none may paint or tell. And men whose sole crime was their hue, the impress of their maker's hand, and frail and shrinking children too, were gathered in that mournful band, ye who have laid your love to rest, and wept above their lifeless clay. Now, know not the anguish of that breast, whose loved are rudely torn away. Ye may not know how desolate our bosoms rudely forced to part, and how a dull and heavy weight will press the life drops from the heart. And we'll talk about this, but when it came to these auctions, essentially everyone was for sale, all the way from young infants or people who were just born, from people all the way to their 60s, 70s, 80s. And if they lived far enough and they were not owned 90s, of course, those who were older and those who were considered weaker or those who were not considered strong enough to do field work were either not purchased or were sold at a very low amount, or or at times were just, to be quite honest, they were not cared for within society. So the second thing that we were talking about was animalization, which is the stripping of humanity by making one more similar to livestock rather than a human being. So this type of dehumanization was also a part of the auctioning off of enslaved people. So this same process would happen during these auctions. So auctioneers would value people via their, by their individual strengths, by how they looked, by their physique, by their specific skills, by their age, especially in the case of women. Because if you owned a person, and this is grim, and this is why I always say, if you have children who are listening to this, please use your best judgment, and also please have conversations with them as well, because slavery was a brutal part in our history. But I also say that we have to talk about this in actuality. But the reason why women, especially of younger ages, were valued high at auction was because if they were of child rearing age, that was essentially, you would own both the enslaved woman and you would also own the child after that woman would have a child, and their temperament. So if for example, if a enslaved person had a previous slave owner and they were sold because that person, that enslaved owner was more likely that enslaved person was more likely to rebel during the auction, it would be said, oh, this person has a temperament that is likely to rebel, or this person is not as, as obedient. And because of that, they would be put at a lower price. Even more specific details would be showcased, such as their teeth. People would request to look at their teeth, and we'll talk about the reason why things like teeth were looked at. If you may be familiar, a lot of enslaved people who were being auctioned off, a lot of it was, oh, look at the nice teeth that they have, and it was because during this time, there was the dental industry, or the scientific advancements of dentistry were not to the point in which people had teeth, or people had teeth well into their 30s and 40s. And we'll actually talk about a very famous individual, actually the first president of the United States, George Washington, who, if you may be familiar, not only created dentures out of things like whale bones and basically animal bones, but he also had a set of dentures that was filled by 9 teeth of 2 enslaved people. So it was not only popular to buy people as a whole, but it was also popular to buy singular body parts of enslaved people at auctions. And it was usually for things like dentures and things like that as well. Um, but there was a dehumanization even after death, like I said before, even whether they be living or dead. A lot of enslaved peoples, their body parts would be used to replace the body parts of other individuals, mainly teeth, mainly cosmetic things. So it's like the purchase of an enslaved person was not just to fulfill a labor need, but it was also basically to essentially other individual body parts, to be quite honest, before and after death. So this is direct information from the Mount Vernon estate. If you don't know, the Mount Vernon estate in Virginia is still it's still standing. It's the home of George Washington, and this is in his records. So his plantation manager actually recorded this. And it says, quote, "We know that George Washington participated in one purchase of teeth from unidentified enslaved persons at Mount Vernon. As recorded of this transaction entered twice in George Washington's financial records. In May 1784, the Mount Vernon plantation manager, Lund Washington, recorded in his journal of accounts under the heading Cash Paid on Account of General Washington the following transaction: to pay Negroes for 9 teeth on account of the French dentist, Dr. LeMay." And Dr. LeMay was essentially the person who would eventually go and make George Washington's dentures out of said 9 teeth. Um, let's go on. We are at Yeah, 15 minutes. All right, so theatric commodification or minstrel entertainment. You're going to see a lot of text because I have an entire 30-page essay on this topic. So I've tried to condense it as much as I could. But minstrelsy or minstrel culture was also something that arose before baseball, before records, before the radio, before even comic books. The first American form of entertainment that was unique to America was minstrel theater, whether it be through dance, theater, film, or art within itself. So, minstrel theater or minstrelsy or minstrel culture is a racist form of entertainment through the mediums of dance, theater, film, and art. Through these mediums, stereotypes towards racial and ethnic groups, mainly Black people, it would mainly be Black people, but there were also, especially when Chinese immigrants were starting to come into the country around the 1800s, there was also a stereotyping of Chinese people as well. Um, but it would mainly be Black people would be introduced as subjects of ridicule and really subjects in which that would kind of be made fun of in these cases. So the first minstrel show happened in 1828, and it was put on by the so-called father of American minstrelsy named Thomas Dartmouth. And he performed a tap dance in blackface. Now, you guys may be familiar with blackface, but historically, blackface is when an individual, a performer, usually who was not Black, sometimes it would be Black actors and individuals, but there's a complicated history around that. Usually they would use a black face paint. Usually it wouldn't be face paint, it would usually be shoe polish, in which they would paint their face to in an over exaggerated format. They might use red paint to overextend their lips to create a very cartoonized version of Black people as well. But and tattered clothes to appear like an enslaved Black person, and sung songs in his interpretation of African American vernacular English. So basically, they would put on an accent to seem as if they were a Black person. They would put on face paint, and that would be a form of entertainment. It was very popular in the South, but it was also very popular in multiple parts of the country, and it stayed popular until I would say the 1960s and 70s. It really didn't fall out of fashion until the 70s, and it's very persistent in our culture actually. If you look at modern day cartoons, like the reason why Mickey Mouse has black skin and white gloves is because of minstrel entertainment. It's very deeply ingrained into our culture, and it's still deeply ingrained into our culture. So minstrelsy caught fire in America or became very popular in America because they were also a way to justify slavery. Minstrelsy was basically trying to portray the image that people who were enslaved or enslaved Black people were actually okay with slavery, which that obviously was not the case. And there were other, horrific things that were happening in slavery. There were lynchings, there were beatings, there were whippings, there was abuse, there was other things going on beyond just being an enslaved person, which was already enough. So said stereotypes continue to be in the fabric of America and other forms of entertainment as well. Um, but when we talk about this, there are really not three, there are four different kind of characters that are created by minstrel entertainment. I'm going to let that truck go so you can hear me a bit more clearly. But there are four characters. There are the Mandingo, which is basically a stereotype Black man. There's the Uncle Tom, which you may have heard of from Uncle Tom's Cabin, which is usually a Black man who's portrayed as being, satisfied with being enslaved or satisfied or, obsessed with their enslaver. And then for women, there was the mammy stereotype, which the mammy stereotype was usually portrayed as being a larger, heavy set, and was portrayed as being satisfied with being enslaved. And the reason why there was a controversy over the Aunt Jemima mascot or the Aunt Jemima in general was that Aunt Jemima is actually a direct lineage of a minstrel character named Aunt Jemima from the 1800s. So there's also that controversy that still stayed within our culture until the late 2010s. I don't think Aunt Jemima was really, was turned into the Pearl Milling Company or whatever it's called until 2020, I believe. Minstrelsy in America, like I said, it's the first it's America's first unique form of entertainment, and it still persists today. And it persists not only in our advertising and our branding. Like another example of the Uncle Tom stereotype is Uncle Ben on rice boxes. So this is still a very consistent thing within our culture. But it also is like it's in our animation, it's in our cartoons, it's also within our even ice cream songs. If you've ever heard some of the ice cream songs that are played by ice cream trucks, those are songs from minstrel culture and minstrel shows. Um, and I wanted to end first, and I talked about this a bit, but I wanted to end because I think we're heading near that time, yeah, of slavery is not just a South people are picking cotton or people are picking sugar cane or people are picking tobacco or rice. This is not just a Southern American thing. This is not just a people worked out in the fields situation. This was not just an agricultural labor thing. Slavery was not only just in the South, but it was also in the North. And it was not just out in the fields, it was also in the house. And one of the things that we as a people now need to especially stop the misconception of was that slavery was one, just confined to the South, and two, was confined just to the fields. There were many domestic laborers who were enslaved for their entire lives. Many domestic laborers or many enslaved people were wet nurses, were midwives, were cooks, were nannies, were maids, were butlers, and they were general servants in general, and whether they be in the house or in the field. One of the misconceptions that we also have is there is a bit of truth to saying that typically most house slaves or most domestic laborers were of lighter skin tone. However, that was because most of those domestic laborers were typically the products of an enslaver or a slave master and an enslaved person. And it was not because they were favored more by the slave master and the enslaver. It was because, unfortunately, it was a non-consensual production of a child in that case. So we have to be very careful about the way that we describe slavery and the way that we think about slavery. Because slavery, like I said before, was not purely of the South. It was a practice that took place in the North as well, and it was a practice that took place both in the field and in the house, and both were equally as brutal. Um, since we're essentially near the end, and we have about 10 minutes, does anyone have any questions or comments they want to just generally say in general? Does anyone want any further clarification on anything, or does anyone want just a sneak peek of what we'll be doing next week when it comes to the Civil War and the Reconstruction era in the South?
I'll jump in real quick. It's Maria again. I just want to thank you for putting together the content for this course. Like you said in the beginning, it just so happens that we were able to start it on the first day of Black History Month, and I'm excited for us. When you first announced it, and then going into it now, so I look forward to the next lesson plans and also just keeping us on track and informed.
Yes. Um, okay, we'll talk about a sneak peek of the what we have prepared for the Civil War and what we'll have prepared for next week when it comes to Civil War and Reconstruction. So, as you may have noticed, this was really heavy on concept and this was really heavy on definitions of words and what exactly happened. Next week is really going to be getting into what you probably learned more in elementary and middle school and high school about specific people. We're going to go over our Harriet Tubmans. We're going to go over our Sojourner Truths. We're going to go over our Frederick Douglasses. We're going to go over those people because we're talking about not only the Civil War, and they're very instrumental during that time, but we're also going to talk about Reconstruction. And as I said before, Reconstruction, which is after 1865, after the Emancipation Proclamation, I would say, and many historians have said, is probably the most violent time in Black history, not only because of the Civil War, but it was also a time in which the South was really kind of bent or was really convicted or was really dead set on keeping the institution of slavery or just keeping what they called a natural social order. And this natural social order of having Black people at the bottom of the totem pole, per se. So a lot of that, because a lot of Black people are actually making financial success, and we'll talk about a lot of different societies, especially towards more the 1910s, like, for example, Oscarville, Tulsa, Oklahoma. We'll talk about that as well. Of because a lot of these Black societies were having economic and social success, a lot of organizations started to spring up, specifically the Ku Klux Klan, as a way to fight against it and as a way to essentially bring terror to a lot of Black communities. And that's why I say it's the most violent time in Black American history, because it is incredibly violent, because it's a response not only to government action, but it's a response to an evolution of the economic activities of Black people at the time. Does anyone have any other questions or any questions about any other of the weeks that we have coming on? The first, to give you a little, just a general rundown, are let me pull up our list here since we have it. Like I said, the second week is the Civil War and Construction. Um, and our third week is going over the Great Migration, uh, Black California settlements, and Black Americans during World War II, World War One, and the Cold War. So this is really, it's going to be actually very specific to California, Black Californian history, and also Redlands history as well. Our fourth week is going to be more modern history. So it's going to talk about policy under the Reagan administration, and also under the Bush and to the Obama administrations. And this is really going to be talking about what happens after the civil rights movement, things like that. And then our fifth through eighth weeks really talk about, it's still very much acknowledging history, but it's talking about art movements. So we're going to be talking about slave narratives in the Harlem Renaissance. We're going to be talking about, and then for the last 3 weeks, we're going to be talking about American music genres. So that comes to jazz, blues, country, and rock and roll. And then my favorite thing, if you know me quite well, we're going to be talking about architecture as well and interior design for our seventh week. And it's mainly going to be around mid-century architecture, so architecture from the 50s to 80s. And then our last week, we're going to do, I think it's going to be a really fun week because I think this is music that we all listen to in some format. We're going to be talking about the development of American music genres, specifically Black American music genres within disco, funk, hip hop, and rap music. And that is how we'll be ending out our course. But besides that, does anyone have any questions before we end our session today? All right. If you
Hey,
would,
Byron. Hey, good afternoon. I'm sorry I'm late. I'm hoping that those that didn't get on earlier, will this be taped? Or, we'll get the recording will be available. Do you know if that's going to be possible? Is it being recorded and will it
I
be
believe it
available?
was
I
recorded.
think it is being okay, so we'll be able to get that. That's definitely. I wasn't on with you when you will be dealing with Jim Crow and how you see that reappearing in our nation today. Jim Crow and all of that, but also a revival of Jim Crowism.
Yes. I think I see it in a way that I think the rhetoric that we have is very similar. During Jim Crow, and I talked about the Ku Klux Klan, but there was also a kind of like the more acceptable or tolerable face of that kind of rhetoric from Jim Crow called the Know Nothing Party, which was it was an anti-immigrant party, but it was also an anti-Black American party. And I think a lot of the rhetoric that we see within the Know Nothing Party is very similar to, unfortunately, a lot of the rhetoric that we're seeing within the Republican Party and a lot of the in my opinion, the MAGA movement that we're seeing. So I think we're seeing a revival of not only the words and rhetoric that was being used, but we're also really seeing, and it's very unfortunate, but I think we're seeing a revival of some of the stereotypes that I was talking about, minstrel culture or minstrel entertainment. We're seeing a revival of a lot of those stereotypes too. So that's what I'm seeing too.
Yeah. Okay.
All right. If you saw in the chat, thank you all for attending. That we will all be finished here. I would like to thank once again the Village SVC for putting on this class and giving me the space and opportunity to speak. And this class and its recording will be available on the Village's YouTube channel. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you so much, Byron.